Vernon Slade dropped the leather ledger onto the table like he was throwing down a verdict. "Your father owed me everything," he said, his voice calm in the way that only truly dangerous men can manage. "Which means you owe me everything, and I've been very patient, Mara." He was 53 years old, well-dressed and smiling. That smile was the worst part. He wasn't angry, he wasn't even cruel in an obvious way. He was certain that a woman alone, with nothing, with a dead father and a pile of debt she never made, had no choice but to say yes. He slid a folded paper across the table, a marriage contract. Already signed by him. "You have 2 days. If that were you, no money, no family, no way out, what would you do?" If this story speaks to you, subscribe to our channel and follow Mara's journey all the way to the end, because what she does next will shock you. Hit the like button and drop a comment with the city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Vernon Slade came to collect, Mara Ellison was standing in the kitchen of a house that no longer belonged to her family, washing a cup that wasn't hers anymore either, though nobody had told her that officially yet. Her father had died 6 weeks before, not dramatically, not with any last wisdom or tearful confession. He'd simply stopped breathing one Tuesday in early November quietly, in the back room where he kept his account books and his bottles, and by the time Mara found him, the fire had gone cold. She'd wrapped him in a blanket before she called anyone, which was probably foolish, but he'd always hated being cold. The debt came later. Or rather, the full picture of the debt came later. She'd known her father struggled. She'd spent the last 3 years managing what she could, cutting costs on the household, selling off furniture piece by piece, keeping the creditors at bay with small payments and smaller apologies. She was good at apologies. She had learned to make them sound like promises without actually promising anything. But she hadn't known about Vernon Slade, not the real amount, not the terms. When Slade's man delivered the ledger to her door on a gray Wednesday morning, Mara sat at the kitchen table for a long time before she opened it. She could tell by the thickness of it, by the quality of the leather cover, that it wasn't good news. Men who kept careful records of small debts didn't bind them in leather. She opened it anyway. The number at the bottom of the last page made her set the book down very carefully, like it might bite her. 3 days later, Vernon Slade came himself. He was not what she'd expected. She'd built him in her mind as red-faced and loud, the kind of man who collected debts the way some men collected grudges noisily, with visible pleasure. But Slade was quiet, well-dressed. He had the manner of someone who had never once needed to raise his voice to get what he wanted, because quiet confidence had always been enough. He sat across from her at her own kitchen table, accepted her offer of coffee, which she resented him for, because now she had to do something with her hands, and opened his copy of the ledger with the practiced ease of a man who had done this before. "Your father was a good man," Slade said. Mara said nothing. "Not a careful man," he continued, "but a good one. He always meant to pay. I believe that about him." He turned a page. "The trouble is meaning to pay and actually paying are two very different things." "How much of this is legitimate?" Mara asked. She kept her voice level. She'd been practicing that. Slade looked up. For just a moment, something flickered behind his eyes, surprise, maybe. Or recalculation. She got the sense he had expected a different kind of conversation. "All of it," he said. "The interest rate listed on page 4 is not what my father recorded in his own books," Mara said. "I found his records." She hadn't meant to lead with that. She'd meant to listen first, understand the shape of what she was dealing with, before she showed him she'd done her homework. But his certainty had annoyed her, and annoyance had always been the thing that made her mouth move before her brain finished its calculation. Slade was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled. "I suggest," he said, "that you be very careful about making accusations you can't prove in front of a judge." "I didn't make an accusation," Mara said. "I asked a question." He closed the ledger. "There's another way to handle this, Mara. Simpler for both of us." He reached into his coat and placed a folded document on the table between them. "Marriage resolves the debt entirely. The property transfers to my name. The obligations disappear. You'd want for nothing." Mara looked at the paper. She didn't touch it. "My father's debt," she said, "was not a marriage contract." "No," Slade agreed pleasantly. But the law has a way of making one feel very much like the other, if you let it. He gave her 2 days. Then he stood, buttoned his coat, thanked her again for the coffee which she hadn't drunk, and walked out. She stood at the window and watched his horse until it disappeared around the corner of the street. And then she stood there a little longer because her legs didn't seem entirely ready to hold her. 2 days. She'd never been married. She was 26 and had spent the last several years of her life keeping her father's household from falling apart, and had never had much time for the normal progression of things: courtship, promises, a future built alongside someone else. She hadn't mourned that. She'd been too busy, but she had never once imagined this as the alternative. She thought about the document on the table for exactly 1 hour. Then she made a decision. She would not be Slade's solution to his own loneliness or his ambitions or whatever it was that made a man like him look at a woman in a bad situation and see an opportunity. She didn't know how she was going to avoid it yet, but she knew she was going to try. The notice in the red willow paper was not her first idea. It was her third. The first idea involved her father's old rifle and a great deal of optimism about her own courage, and she dismissed it before the thought fully formed. The second involved leaving, just taking her one good suitcase and walking away from the debt entirely, but she'd thought through that road, and it ended badly. A woman alone with no money and no destination, in the kind of winter that was already chewing through the last of October, didn't last long. The third idea was the one she circled back to twice before she admitted to herself she was actually considering it. Mail-order arrangements were not uncommon. She knew that. She wasn't naive about the realities of them. Either knew that they were transactional, that they required a woman to make peace with a great many unknowns, that they had gone terribly wrong for other women in ways that weren't discussed in polite company. She knew all of that. She also knew that a legal marriage to someone else was the one thing Slade couldn't purchase around. She wrote the letter carefully, rewriting it 4 times before she sent it. She didn't try to make herself sound appealing in the way that she imagined men wanted. She didn't describe herself in any particular flattering way, didn't mention that she was considered reasonably pretty, didn't embellish. She was direct about what she was. A woman in a difficult situation who needed a fresh start somewhere far from Red Willow, who knew how to work hard, manage a household budget, and keep her head in difficult circumstances. She said she was not afraid of hard work or bad weather. She wasn't looking for love, she wrote. She was looking for a fair arrangement. 3 letters came back. 2 she dismissed immediately, for reasons she couldn't quite articulate. Something in the handwriting, something in the way the words were arranged that felt wrong. The third was from a man named Silas Crowe on Frostpine Ridge, and it was the shortest of the 3. It was also the most honest. He wrote that he ran a timber operation and kept pack mules, that the winters were brutal and the isolation was real, and she should know that going in. That he was 34 and had been alone for 8 years and was not especially easy company. That he wasn't asking for anything beyond what a practical arrangement required. That he would provide a roof and supplies in his word, and he kept his word. He did not say he was a good man. That omission, more than anything, made her trust him a little. She wrote back yes. The reply came faster than she expected, just over a week, and it contained a date and a meeting place, and nothing sentimental. She told no one in Red Willow. She made her arrangements quietly. She took her one battered suitcase and packed what mattered: her mother's shawl, 3 practical dresses, her father's account, books, and the small ledger where she had been keeping her own careful notes about Slade's numbers. She left before dawn. The stagecoach north was cold and long, and she sat across from a woman who fell asleep immediately and a man who kept trying to start a conversation about the difficulty of mountain travel in November, which was not a conversation Mara wanted to have. She spent most of the journey looking out the window at the sky, darkening ahead of them, and trying not to think too hard about what she was doing. She had calculated the odds. She was a woman who calculated odds. The calculation kept coming back to the same answer. This was the better risk. That didn't make it any less terrifying. She met Silas Crowe at a small courthouse in a town whose name she'd already forgotten by the time they walked inside. He was taller than she'd imagined from the letter, not impressively so, but solidly built, the kind of man who had done physical work for so long that his body had simply arranged itself around that fact. He had dark hair going gray at the temples, and the kind of face that was hard to read, not because he was hiding anything, but because he simply didn't move it much. He looked at her when she arrived and nodded once, as though she had confirmed something he already knew. "Miss Ellison," he said. "Mr. Crowe," she said. That was their entire pre-ceremony conversation. The ceremony itself took 11 minutes. She knew because she counted. The magistrate was an older man who seemed faintly baffled by both of them by her. Mara thought, because she was too composed for a bride, and by Silas because he answered every required question in the shortest possible grammatical form. When it was over, Silas signed the register and handed her the pen. She signed beside his name and felt, for just a second, the strange weight of what she'd done. She was married to a man she'd spoken 4 words to. She was also no longer Vernon Slade's solution to anything. That second fact helped considerably with the first. They walked out of the courthouse into air that smelled like snow coming, and Silas looked at the sky the way a man does when he's reading it rather than admiring it. "We need to move," he said. "Storm's close." "How far is the ridge?" she asked. "Few hours. Maybe less if the mules cooperate." He looked at her suitcase. "That all you brought?" "Yes." Something in his face shifted almost imperceptibly. Not pity. She would have been furious at pity. It was something closer to respect, though she couldn't be entirely sure of that either. "All right," he said, and they moved. She rode beside him on a horse he'd borrowed from someone in town. He explained this briefly, that he'd bring it back in spring, and they didn't talk much. She was fine with that. She'd never been someone who needed to fill silence with words, and the silence between them was not yet comfortable exactly, but it wasn't threatening either. It was just the silence of 2 strangers who had agreed to something enormous and were each privately trying to figure out what that meant. About an hour into the ride, the snow started, not soft. Not the gentle beginning-of-season snow that looked pretty in someone else's window. This was the kind of snow that meant business. The kind that came in sideways and turned the world into a gray nothing in under 10 minutes. Mara pulled her coat tighter and said nothing because there was nothing useful to say. Silas rode without any visible alarm, which she chose to interpret as competence rather than indifference. "You're not scared," he said. It wasn't a question exactly. "I'm scared," Mara said. "I'm just not going to let it be the loudest thing about me." He didn't respond to that, but she had the sense he was thinking about it. The ridge came into view through the snow as a dark shape first, then slowly as something more defined. By the time she could make out the cabin properly, it was already late afternoon, and the light was doing strange things through the storm, everything flat and gray and white. She saw the initials before she saw almost anything else about the cabin. They were carved above the doorframe, deep, deliberate. Someone had meant them to last. 2 letters, not hers, a woman's name or most of one. Mara looked at them for a moment. Then she looked at Silas. He was already at the mules, unbuckling the packs, not looking at the door. She understood immediately that he knew they were there, and that he had not thought to mention them. She couldn't decide yet what that meant, whether it was thoughtlessness or something else. She filed it away. She picked up her suitcase and walked through the door beneath someone else's name. The inside of the cabin was warm from the banked fire. Silas must have left before riding to town, and it smelled like wood smoke and pine resin and something faintly like a life that had already been lived here. She put her suitcase down. She looked around at the kitchen shelves, the curtain over the one window, the folded quilt on the chair by the fire. The quilt had small flowers stitched along the edge in blue thread. Careful work. Someone who had expected to stay. She put her hands flat on the kitchen table and breathed. She had escaped one man who wanted to own her future. She was standing in another woman's home, and outside the snow kept falling, sealing the ridge off from the rest of the world until spring. Mara Ellison, Mara Crowe now, she supposed, stood in that kitchen and made herself be still. She was good at being still. She had learned it at her father's bedside, at the table across from creditors, in the long nights running calculations on whether there was any path out that didn't end in surrender. She was still looking at the stitched flowers on that quilt when Silas came through the door, stamping snow off his boots. "Fire's good," he said. "Supplies are in the back room. Mules are settled." She turned around. "Who made the quilt?" He stopped. The question hung there between them in the warm air of the cabin, and for just a moment she saw something cross his face that she couldn't name, not guilt, not anger. "Something older than either of those things. Old one," he said finally. "Useful." Mara looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked back at the quilt. "I'm sure it is," she said. She didn't push it. Not that night. She was tired and cold and married, and a long way from everything she had ever known, and some things could wait until morning, when she had slept and her edges were less raw. But she remembered the initials above the door, and the quilt with the careful flowers, and the way Silas had said "useful" in a voice that meant something different from the word. She understood that this marriage, this practical, transactional, nothing romantic arrangement had a ghost in it already. She just didn't know yet whether the ghost was something she could live with. She made supper from what she found in the back room: beans, dried meat, the end of a bread loaf, and put it on the table without ceremony. And Silas sat down and ate without commentary, which she appreciated. She had no patience that evening for small talk or gratitude or any of the social performances she'd spent years maintaining for her father's sake. When the food was gone, he cleared the dishes that surprised her, and she sat with her hands around a tin cup of hot water because the tea had run out and she wasn't going to say anything about it. "You can take the bed," he said, not looking up from where he was stacking the bowls. "I'll be fine by the fire. We're married," she said. Not flirtatiously. "Just as a fact, we're strangers," he said. "Both things are true," she said. He turned around and looked at her, and she met his eyes without flinching, which seemed to catch him slightly off guard. He wasn't used to being looked at directly. She could tell. "The bed's in the back," he said. "You take it tonight. We'll figure the rest out." She didn't argue. She was too tired. She took the lamp and went to the back room and sat on the edge of the bed for a moment before she lay down. She could hear the storm against the roof. The wind had teeth now, coming through the ridge with real intention, and the cabin creaked under it in a way that sounded alarming until she understood it wasn't going anywhere, that this structure had been built by someone who knew what the mountain could do. She lay in the dark and listened to Silas moving quietly in the other room, banking the fire, settling in for the night. She thought about Slade, wondered if he'd found her letter of withdrawal yet, the one she'd left with a neighbor, to deliver the morning after she'd gone. She'd written it carefully, very legally, stating her marriage, citing her new name, making sure there was no ambiguity about the fact that his debt claim had no claim over a married woman's independent life. She hoped it had made him furious. That thought, more than anything, was what let her sleep. She woke before dawn to the sound of an axe, not inside the cabin outside, somewhere down the slope where the timber stood thick and close. A steady rhythm. Strike, pause, strike. The kind of sound a man makes when he's been doing the same work for so long that his body does it without him having to think about it. Mara lay still for a moment and stared at the ceiling and let herself feel exactly where she was and what she'd done. She'd learned that habit from her father's worst years: don't avoid the feeling. Just look at it directly first thing in the morning before the day gets loud enough to drown it out. If you let the fear sit in your chest unnamed all day, it turned into something worse by evening. So she looked at it. She was on a mountain she'd never been to, married to a man she'd spoken maybe 40 words to, in a bed that smelled faintly of someone else's cedar chest. There was a carved name above the front door that wasn't hers. There was a quilt by the fire with flowers she hadn't stitched. Outside, a man she'd legally bound herself to was already at work at first of light without having knocked on her door, or called her name, or checked whether she was still breathing. She took stock of all of that, nodded to it, and got up. Coals. She fed it, found the water pail, found where he kept the coffee, good coffee. She noted one of the few extravagances visible in an otherwise stripped-down kitchen, and started a pot. She found eggs. 4 of them. She made them without ceremony, hard-cooked the way they kept longest. Silas came through the door around the time the coffee finished. He was covered in wood chips, and his breath was still heavy from the work. He stopped when he saw breakfast on the table. "You didn't have to," he said. "I know," Mara said. She poured him a cup and sat down across from him with her own. "Tell me what the work schedule looks like." He looked at her the same way he'd looked at her when she'd said she was scared, but not going to let it be the loudest thing about her. Like she had briefly said something that required a small recalibration. "Timber runs through late March," he said, sitting. "Early starts, mules need feeding before the work. There's a line of contracts to fill before the ground freezes solid and we lose the trail access." "How many contracts?" He named a number and a dollar amount. She did the arithmetic in her head. "That's tight," she said. He looked up. "You understand timber contracts?" "I understand margins," she said. "My father ran a dry goods business into the ground. I ran it before he finished. I know what tight looks like." He was quiet for a moment, drinking his coffee. She could tell he wasn't sure what to do with her yet. She was fine with that. She wasn't sure what to do with him either. "I can take the mule feeding," she said, "and I'll keep the accounts if you'll show me what you have." Silas set the cup down. "The accounts are fine. I'm sure they are," she said, and she let the silence do the rest of the work. He looked at her across the table. Something in his jaw tightened slightly. Not angry, more like a man who was used to doing things alone, and was finding that reality rearranging itself in minor, uncomfortable ways. "I'll show you the ledger after supper," he said. "Thank you," said Mara. She washed the dishes. He went back out. The axe started again. She spent the morning going through the kitchen properly, not because it was disordered, exactly, but because she needed to know what she had and where it was. Inventory was how she'd always managed fear. Count the cans. Know the flour supply. Understand the actual situation rather than the imagined one. That was when she found the cup. It was at the back of the upper shelf, behind the tin mugs he used daily, pushed into the corner with the deliberateness of something put away rather than forgotten. A blue ceramic cup, painted with a small pattern around the rim. It was the kind of cup you bought in town, because it was pretty, not because it was practical. It didn't belong on a mountain timber operation. It belonged on a windowsill in a proper house somewhere, maybe with a saucer underneath it. Mara held it for a moment, then she put it back exactly where she'd found it. She found the dried wildflowers an hour later, tied with a bit of twine and hung above the small window in the main room. They were completely dried out years old. She guessed their color so faded that she couldn't tell anymore what kind they'd been. She left those too. That afternoon, while Silas was still out on the slope, she stood in the main room and looked at the space with clear eyes. The quilt over the chair, the blue cup behind the others, the dried flowers, the initials above the door, which she couldn't see from inside, but knew were there. This wasn't just a cabin. This was a preserved moment in time. Silas Crowe had not been living here for 8 years. He had been keeping something here for 8 years. Keeping the temperature of it, making sure it didn't decay too far. She wasn't angry about it. Not exactly. She was something more complicated than angry, something closer to tired, the specific kind of tired that comes from understanding a situation you have no good options inside of. She sat down at the table and put her chin in her hand and thought hard. She had not come to Frostpine Ridge to live inside someone else's memory. She'd left Red Willow precisely because she refused to be someone else's arrangement, someone else's resolution to someone else's problem. She had married Silas Crowe because the letter he'd written contained not one word of pretense, and she had believed that meant she was getting an honest situation. This was an honest situation. She just hadn't known to ask about the ghosts. Silas came in at dusk. She had supper on. He washed, sat, ate. He wasn't a man who made noise just to fill silence, which she had already decided she appreciated. Some men could not tolerate quiet. It seemed to agitate them into talking about nothing, filling rooms with empty sound. Silas moved through silence the way he moved through the snow, like it was just weather, not a problem. "The ledger," she said, after the dishes were cleared. He went to the back room and came out with a battered account book, set it on the table between them. She opened it. He sat across from her and watched her read it, which she could feel but didn't comment on. His bookkeeping was not bad. It was honest, At least he didn't fudge numbers or dress things up. Every entry was what it was. But there were inefficiencies she could see immediately. Contracts that should have been structured differently. Supply costs that could be reduced with some planning ahead. She was quiet while she read. He was quiet while she read. The fire settled. "You're underselling the mule work," she said finally. "The mule work covers the mule costs," he said. "By about 4%, she said. "If one animal gets hurt or sick, you're running at a loss on that contract." He looked at her, not defensively, more like a man who had made peace with a tight margin a long time ago and had not looked at it again recently. "I'll need to see your supplier invoices," she said. "And the contracts themselves, not just the ledger summaries." Silas was quiet for a moment. "You always been this direct?" "No," she said honestly. "I used to apologize first." It wasted everyone's time. Something happened at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. He brought the contracts. She stayed up past the fire's best hours, working through them, making notes in her own small handwriting in the margins of the paper she'd found in the supply room. Silas fell asleep in the chair by the fire sometime around the second hour, and she worked in the reduced light and listened to him breathe and thought that this was a very strange life she had chosen, but perhaps not an unbearable one. 3 days passed, then 4. They built a routine him out before full light, her managing the mules and the kitchen and the accounts, supper on the table at the same time each evening, the brief exchange of information that passed between them as conversation. She learned that he took his coffee without anything added. He learned that she couldn't eat the dried beef without soaking it first. He learned to leave the mule harnesses where she could reach them. She learned not to reorganize his tool wall. On the 5th morning, she moved the quilt. She didn't throw it away. She wasn't a destructive person, and she wasn't petty. She folded it and put it in the chest at the foot of the back room, which was where blankets lived, and she hung her mother's shawl over the chair by the fire instead. Small thing. It was also very deliberate. Silas noticed that evening. She watched him notice it. His eyes moved to the chair, and he paused for just a fraction of a second. Not enough that he'd probably meant to show it, and then he went and hung his coat and sat down. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. But the air in the cabin was slightly different that night, charged with something unsaid. On the 7th day, she asked him directly. They were finishing supper. The storm from the first night had broken, but another one was coming. She could feel it the way she'd been slowly learning to feel the mountain's moods, a tightening of the air, a specific quality of silence from the trees. Silas was going over a timber measurement in his head. She could tell by the way he'd gone quiet in a focused rather than empty way. "Silas," she said. He looked up. "When you look at me," she said, "do you see me, or do you see the life you were to have?" He went very still. She hadn't planned the question in those exact words. It was the truest way she could think to say it, so she said it. He didn't answer immediately. That was something she'd noticed about him. He didn't fill silence with the first available words the way most people did. He actually thought before he spoke. She usually appreciated it. Right now it made her stomach tight. "I don't know you well enough yet to see you properly," he said finally. "That's honest," she said. "You asked for honest." "I did." She turned her cup in her hands, the initials above the door. The cup behind the others on the shelf, the dried flowers. She kept her voice level. "You kept all of it." He was quiet again. This time it lasted long enough that she could hear the fire. "Didn't seem worth taking down," he said. It was there. "It tells me," Mara said carefully, "that you've been waiting for something to go back to." Not forward, back. She watched that land. She watched him take it and sit with it, watched something shift behind his eyes in a way that wasn't comfortable for either of them. "I'm not asking you to erase it," she said. "I'm asking you to tell me whether there's any room in this arrangement for who I actually am, or whether the shape of this life was already set before I got here." Silas pushed back from the table, stood. For a moment she thought he was going to leave the room, which was what she'd half expected, what people did when a conversation got to the honest place. They left. They busied themselves with something else, and came back when the air had cleared. He didn't leave. He stood at the window with his back to her, and she could see the set of his shoulders the way he held the weight of what she'd said. Her name was Clara, he said. He didn't turn around. We were going to be married. She came up here once, saw the cabin and left. Said she couldn't do it. Said the mountain was, he stopped. She wasn't wrong. It's a hard life, I know, Mara said. I spent a year thinking she'd come back, he said. Then I stopped thinking she'd come back and just kept going. You do that. You just keep going. You kept her things, Mara said. He turned around. His face was difficult to read, but there was something raw at the edges of it, the look of a man who had not talked about this to anyone in a very long time and was finding the words, "Don't come back," as easy as you'd think. I didn't keep them as I didn't look at them, Mara. I didn't sit in the evenings and think about her. I just didn't take them down. It seemed like a lot of effort to take them down. Or it seemed final, she said. He said nothing. Finality is scary, she said. I understand that. I'm not angry at you for it. Then what are you? She thought about it. Concerned, she said. That I traded one situation where I was filling someone else's idea of a role for another one. That landed hard. She saw it. You're not her, he said. I know I'm not. I didn't bring you here thinking you were. Maybe not consciously, she said. The fire cracked. Outside, the first sounds of the new storm were starting in the tops of the trees, that specific high whisper that came before the real wind. Silas looked at her for a long time. She held his gaze and didn't soften it or apologize for the conversation, because she had meant every word of it, and she'd been doing enough apologizing for other people's comfort over the last several years to last her a lifetime. Then something in him changed. She wasn't sure she could fully explain what she saw. It was like watching a man make a decision that he'd been avoiding, and then suddenly realize the avoiding was costing him more than the deciding. He reached for his coat. Where are you going? She asked, because the storm was genuinely arriving now. He didn't answer. He went out through the front door, and she heard the wind come in hard for the second before it closed. She sat at the table and waited, which was not something she was patient at. She was a woman who fixed things. Sitting and waiting felt like doing nothing, and doing nothing felt like failing. But she sat. She heard something outside that she couldn't quite identify over the wind, a scraping sound, irregular but deliberate. It went on for several minutes. Then the door opened, and Silas came back in trailing snow and cold air, and he was putting his hunting knife back in his belt. He hung his coat and stood at the threshold of the main room and met her eyes. She didn't understand for a moment, then she did. She stood up from the table and walked to the door and opened it, feeling the full force of the storm push back against her, and she looked up at the doorframe. The initials were gone. Not carved over, not replaced, just gone. Cut away. The wood scarred where they'd been but clean of any letter. Scar was raw and pale against the older timber. It would fade, it would take time and weather and years, but it would fade. She stood there in the doorway with the snow coming sideways at her, and the cold working its way through her clothes, and she felt something she hadn't felt since before her father got sick. Something she didn't immediately have a name for because she'd been without it long enough that she didn't recognize it right away. It might have been the beginning of being safe. She wasn't sure. She came back inside and closed the door. Silas was standing in the same place he'd been standing. He was looking at her with the careful expression of a man who has done something he can't take back and is waiting to learn whether it was right. I can't erase the scar, he said. I know that. I'm not asking you to erase the scar, she said. Her voice came out quieter than she'd intended. I never was. She walked back to the table and sat down. After a moment, he sat too. The storm got loud. They let it. There was something different in the cabin now, not fixed. Nothing was fixed. Nothing between two people who had known each other 11 days could be called fixed. But the air was different, like a room after a window's been opened, even briefly, even in winter. She reached across the table and turned his ledger to a new page. The supply contract with the mill at Harker's Crossing, she said. You're paying 11% over the going rate. I can write the letter to renegotiate. He blinked. Then he sat forward. You know the Harker's rate? I know what I read, she said. I read everything. He leaned over and looked at what she'd written on the margin of his ledger, the numbers she'd been running, and she could tell by the slight change in his breathing that he was genuinely surprised. Not condescendingly surprised, not the kind of surprised that means I didn't think you'd be capable. More the kind that meant I didn't expect help from this direction, and I don't quite know what to do with it. You're going to argue that down by 11%, he said. At minimum, she said. He sat back, rubbed the side of his jaw, which was something he did when he was thinking. All right, he said. That was all, but it was something. The storm raged for 2 days. They were inside together for most of it, which was its own particular kind of pressure, two people learning to occupy the same space without either of them feeling crushed. She discovered that he read, which surprised her, a small collection of worn books on a shelf she hadn't noticed before because it was behind the door. He discovered that she talked in her sleep, which embarrassed her when he mentioned it, and which he mentioned once and then never again. She reorganized the kitchen with his consent this time, which improved the efficiency of the morning routine by a visible margin that he didn't comment on, but that she observed him appreciating. On the second night of the storm, he made supper. She sat at the table and watched him do it. Badly, he overcooked the beans and undersalted everything, and she ate it without complaint, every bite, because he'd made it, and that was its own kind of statement. This is terrible, he said, eating his own portion. It's fine, she said. It's not fine, Mara. No, she admitted. It really isn't. He looked up and the corner of his mouth moved in that way again, the almost smile, and she felt herself almost smile back. And the cabin was warm, and the storm was loud, and somewhere under the layers of strangeness and caution, and the 10,000 things neither of them had said yet, something small and tentative was putting out the equivalent of a first root. She didn't name it. She wasn't ready to name it. But she noticed it. The morning the storm broke, she put a wild flower dried from the bunch she'd taken down and thought about throwing away and hadn't in the tin cup by the window. Not the blue ceramic one. Her own cup. Silas saw it when he came in for the midday meal. He stood in the doorway for a moment, coat still on, just looking at it. She was at the table, and she watched him without appearing to watch him. He didn't say anything. He came in and sat down, and she put food in front of him, and he ate. But he ate facing the window, and once, just briefly, she caught him looking at the flower. The weeks after the storm settled into something approaching a rhythm, though rhythm was probably too smooth a word for it. It was more like two people slowly learning to move through the same space without constantly running into each other, literally and otherwise. They made mistakes. He forgot she'd rearranged the supply room and said something sharp about it that he apologized for 3 hours later, stiffly, the apology of a man who didn't do it often and wasn't comfortable with the mechanics of it. She pushed too hard on the account books one evening when he was tired from a long day on the slope and he shut down entirely, and she had to recognize that she'd read his availability wrong and back off. They were imperfect. That was what kept it real. She wrote the letter to Harker's Crossing. She wrote it carefully, firm but professional, citing market rates she'd asked Silas to verify with a man he knew in town. The reply came back in just over 2 weeks, agreeable to a revised rate that saved them enough over the season to matter. Silas read the letter and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You've done this before. Managed someone else's failing business while they refused to listen," she said. "Yes, different work, same principle." He looked at her with that careful expression she was starting to read better. "I listen," he said. "You do," she agreed. And she meant it. Whatever else Silas Crowe was or wasn't, he listened. She had stopped thinking about Red Willow every morning. She noticed that one day and found it significant. She was thinking about the timber contracts instead, and the spring supply calculation, and the fact that 2 of the mules needed new tack before the heavy loads resumed, and whether there was a way to reach a second mill before the mountain pass hardened into impassability. Real things, present things. She was beginning tentatively to live here rather than to merely survive here. Then Silas came in one afternoon, moving differently fast, with that particular tightening of purpose that she'd learned meant something was wrong, and she looked up from the accounts. "Rider," he said. "Coming up the south trail." She went to the window. Through the trees she could make out a figure on a dark horse, well-dressed, picking his way up the frozen trail with the careful deliberateness of someone who was not accustomed to mountain terrain but had decided it didn't matter. She knew that deliberateness. She knew the set of those shoulders. Her hands went flat on the table. The accounts could wait. "Do you know him?" Silas asked, coming to stand beside her. She turned from the window. Her face was what she'd trained it to be composed, reading nothing aloud that she hadn't chosen to share. "Yes," she said. Silas looked at her and then looked back at the rider, and then looked at her again. "Mara, his name is Vernon Slade," she said. She pulled her hands off the table. They were perfectly steady, and she was proud of that, even though there was no one to be proud of her for it except herself. "Come from Red Willow." She turned away from the window and straightened the front of her dress and looked at the door. "He brought a ledger," she said, because she already knew he had. That was Slade's weapon of choice, not threats you could report to anyone, not violence you could defend against, but numbers. Neat, organized, damning numbers in leather covers, presented with complete confidence by a man who had never once doubted that money was the realest thing in the world. "He came all the way up the ridge in November," Silas said. "He's thorough," she said. "I should have warned you." "You should have," Silas agreed, and his voice was careful but not unkind. She looked at him. He was looking at the window, jaw set, the expression of a man taking stock of a situation that just became considerably more complicated than it had been 5 minutes ago. "I'm sorry," she said, and she meant it not as a performance, not as the reflexive apology she'd spent years deploying to smooth things over. Genuinely sorry that she had landed him in this. "Don't apologize yet," Silas said. He pulled his coat back on. "Let's see what he says first." He was already moving toward the door. Mara stood in the cabin in her cabin. She had decided, in the weeks since she'd moved the quilt and put the wildflower in the cup and renegotiated the Harkers' contract, and she breathed twice, carefully, and then she followed her husband out to meet the man who had ridden all the way up a mountain in the beginning of winter to claim that he still owned her future. The cold hit her face when she stepped outside. Slade reined his horse to a stop at the edge of the yard and looked down at them both, and when his eyes found Mara, his expression did exactly what she'd expected it to do, settled into that particular kind of calm pleasure that he wore when he believed he was in control of a situation. "Mrs. Crowe," he said. The name hit different coming out of his mouth. She hadn't expected that, but she kept her face where she'd put it. "Mr. Slade," she said. "You've come a long way, I have," he said. He looked at Silas with the measuring look of a man doing arithmetic. "And I expect the ride was worth it." He reached into his saddlebag and drew out the ledger. She had known he would have it. She had told Silas he would have it. But seeing it again, the same leather cover, the same brass clasp, the same weight of all those fabricated numbers dressed up as facts, made something cold move through her chest. Silas was standing beside her, not in front of her. Beside her. She noticed that. "Come inside," Silas said, and his voice had gone to a register she hadn't heard from him before, flat, stripped of warmth, a voice that gave nothing away and promised nothing good. "You can say what you came to say in the warm." Slade dismounted with the fluid ease of a man who had spent his life never doing anything under duress, and the three of them went inside. Slade sat at their table like he owned it. That was the thing Mara noticed first, not what he said, not even the ledger he placed in front of him with that practiced, unhurried motion. It was the way he sat, elbows forward, shoulders relaxed, the posture of a man who had walked into rooms his entire life, expecting them to rearrange themselves around him. He looked at the cabin the way buyers looked at livestock, assessing, calculating, already dividing it into what it was worth and what it might yield. Silas stood near the door. He hadn't sat. Mara understood that sitting would have meant settling in for a conversation, and Silas had not yet decided this deserved one. She put coffee on because her hands needed something to do and because refusing hospitality to a man you despised was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. She needed to think. She needed Slade talking, not suspicious while she thought. "Nice piece of land," Slade said, looking toward the window. "More timber than I expected." "What do you want, Slade?" Silas said. It wasn't a question. Slade opened the ledger with the same motion he'd used in her father's kitchen, deliberate, unhurried, like he was unwrapping something he already knew was good. I want what's owed, he said, same as I've always wanted. The debt your wife's father accumulated over 14 years doesn't disappear because she rode up a mountain and signed a piece of paper. The debt has nothing to do with me, Silas said. The debt has everything to do with you now, Slade said pleasantly. She's your wife. Her obligations are your obligations. That's not my opinion. That's how the law reads it. He turned a page. I've had a lawyer look at this specifically. Mara set the coffee cups on the table and sat down. Kept her hands flat on her thighs, where no one could see whether they were steady. Show me the page, she said. Slade looked at her. There was something in his expression that was almost appreciative, the look of a man who had expected a more easily frightened opponent. Page 6, he said. The principal, she looked at it. The number was the same as the one she'd seen in Red Willow, the large, impossible number, the one that had made her set the ledger down carefully on her father's kitchen table. But she looked past that number, the way she'd trained herself to look past the first number and find the real one underneath. The interest accrual on page 9, she said, compounded as agreed. Agreed by whom, she said. There's no signature on the interest terms in this ledger. There's a signature on the original loan. The interest terms appear to have been added later. She looked up. The ink is a slightly different shade. The room was very quiet. Slade looked at her without moving for a moment. Then he smiled. That's a very serious accusation, he said. I made the same observation in Red Willow, she said. You told me to be careful. I'm being careful. I'm being very precise, actually. Silas had moved from the door. He was standing at the end of the table now, not sitting, not looming, just present. She felt that presence the way you feel a wall at your back. Comfortable, exactly, not yet, but solid. Slade closed the ledger. Not in retreat, he'd simply decided the ledger portion of the conversation was finished. Here's what I think, Slade said. He turned to look at Silas the way a man looks at something he's measuring for purchase. I think you've got a good operation here. Timber, mules, the trail access. I think you're a man who works hard and doesn't want legal trouble on top of hard work. He paused. I'm a patient man. I've given your wife time. I've been reasonable. But there are limits to my patience, and I'm telling you directly. The courts in Red Willow know my name. They don't know yours. Silas was quiet for a long moment. Mara watched him. She could see him doing what she did, taking the actual measure of the situation, not the emotional one. Slade had money and town connections and a lawyer. They had a mountain and a timber operation, and the beginning of a working partnership, and not enough cash on hand to fight anything in court for long. You're threatening us, Silas said. I'm describing reality, Slade said. What do you want? Silas said again. Same flat tone. Same refusal to dress the question up. I want the debt settled, Slade said. The full amount on page 6, plus the accrued interest on page 9. Given he looked around the cabin. Current situation, I'm prepared to accept timber, property liens, and labor contracts as partial settlement. I'm not unreasonable. He was talking about Silas's mules, his contracts, the timber on the slope, everything Silas had built in 8 years of working alone on this mountain. Mara saw it clearly. Slade hadn't come just for her. He'd come because she'd led him to something worth taking. The thought made her feel sick in a way that was specifically different from fear. It was guilt. She had brought this here. She had placed this man at this table. She looked at Silas. He was looking at Slade. His expression had gone to that stripped-down register again, the one she'd heard in his voice outside flat, giving nothing away. But she knew him well enough by now to read the thing underneath it. He was furious. He was deeply, quietly furious in the way of men who have built something with their own hands and are watching someone try to price it. I need time to consider, Silas said. Slade nodded. I'll be at the inn in Caldwell Crossing. I'll give you a week. He stood and buttoned his coat. I'd encourage you not to wait on this, Mr. Crowe. The weather gets considerably worse, I understand, and I'd prefer not to make this trip a second time. Picked up the ledger. Mara watched his hand on it and thought, that book is a weapon. He carries it the way other men carry guns. Silas showed him out without ceremony. He heard the horse. heard Slade ride away down the trail, and then the door opened, and Silas came back in, and the cold came with him, and she was still sitting at table with her hands flat on her thighs. "I'm sorry," she said again. "Stop apologizing," he said. He didn't say it harshly. He said it the way you say stop doing that to someone who is hurting themselves. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. They looked at each other across the table. "How bad is the actual debt?" he asked. "The real number, not his number." "I need my father's records," she said. "They're in my suitcase, but based on what I've already gone through the legitimate principal, the interest at the original rate, not the rate he added later, it's roughly a third of what that ledger shows." "A third," Silas repeated. "Maybe a little more, but not much more." He was quiet. She could see him calculating the same way she'd been calculating since Slade appeared on the trail, running numbers, measuring resources, trying to find the path through. "The timber contracts through March," he said slowly. "Plus the spring run, if we push the production schedule. It's not enough by spring," she said. "I've already run it." "Not if he holds to that number." Silas leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. She knew that expression now, too, the expression of a man who was not giving up, but was making himself face the full weight of a thing before he decided what to do with it. "He'll take the mules," Silas said. "If I can't pay." "He'll take the contracts." "Yes, and then the timber rights." "Yes, and then the land itself." "That's the progression," she said. She hated saying it. "I'm sorry," she stopped herself. He'd told her to stop apologizing. "I knew he was the kind of man who didn't stop. I should have told you everything before we married." "Would I have said no?" he asked. She looked at him. She didn't answer because she genuinely didn't know, and she wasn't going to invent a comforting answer. "I don't think I would have," he said, and the honesty of it moved through her in a way she didn't have a name for. He stood up. He was going to go outside and work. She knew that when Silas Crowe didn't know what to do with something, he went and split wood, or checked the mule lines, or walked the timber slope, because physical work was how he processed difficulty. She'd learned that about him. He was at the door when she said, "Don't do anything to him." He turned. "I mean physically," she said. "I know that's where your mind goes." "Mine goes there too. But if anything happens to him on this mountain, his lawyers use it and we lose everything faster." Silas looked at her for a long moment. "I wasn't going to." "I know," she said. "I'm saying it anyway." Something in his face shifted, a slight softening, not quite a smile, but in the neighborhood of one. "You think you know me pretty well," he said. "I know you well enough," she said. He left. The act started. She sat at the table for a little while, letting herself feel the full weight of the situation. Then she went and got her suitcase from the back room and took out her father's account books and sat back down and started working. She worked until her eyes hurt. The fire burned down and she rebuilt it without stopping. She ate something cold from the morning because she didn't want to take the time to cook. She made notes in 3 separate columns: what the ledger showed, what her father's records showed, what she could prove, and what she could only argue. The difference between the two numbers was, as she'd told Silas, approximately a third. But a third of Slade's inflated number was still more than they had on hand. Silas came in around dark, cold and tired, and she told him to eat something, and he did, standing at the kitchen counter because she was using the whole table. He looked at her papers without touching them. "You've been at that all day," he said. "Yes." "Find anything?" "The interest terms were definitely added after the fact," she said. "The original loan agreement, I have a copy in my father's book. His own notation specifies a flat rate. No compounding. Slade changed it somewhere in the last 3 years." She tapped the page. "Problem is proving that in court. My father's notation versus Slade's ledger." "His lawyer versus us," Silas said. "Versus us," she agreed. He sat down on the edge of the chair across from her and put his hands on the table and looked at the papers. His hands were rough from the day's work, knuckles slightly raw from the cold. "I've been thinking," he said. "Tell me, what if I offered to settle the principal myself?" he said. "The real number, your number in timber and labor, and what cash I have. But only if he signs something full release, permanent, against you and against the property." She looked at him. "You'd take on my father's debt." The legitimate portion, he said. I'm not paying his inflated version. But the real amount, yeah. I can build to that. It'll take 2, maybe 3 years of tight running, but I can get there. She was quiet. The fire popped. I won't let you do that, she said. Mara, I won't let another man pay for my freedom, she said. That's the same as Slade's arrangement, just with different paperwork. Silas looked at her with an expression that was sharp and direct and entirely undefended. It's not the same, he said, not even close. Slade wanted to own you. I'm talking about paying off a number so nobody has a claim over my wife or my land. He stopped and then said it plainly. That's what a husband does. The word hit her differently than it had the 11 times before that she'd heard it. Husband. He'd never said it about himself before. She'd noticed that. 3 years is a long time to carry someone else's debt, she said. You're not someone else, he said. And then, as if he'd surprised himself, he looked briefly away and then back and said, You're the person who renegotiated the Harker's contract. You're the person who found the interest discrepancy in that ledger. You think I don't know what that's worth? She was quiet. I'm making a business proposal, he said, a little roughly, as though the honesty had gotten in further than he'd meant it to. Pure and practical, is it? She said. He didn't answer that. But the corner of his mouth did the thing. They sat with that for a moment. If you go to Slade with an offer, she said finally. Carefully, go with the real number only. Don't offer more, and I want to be there. He started to say something. I want to be there, she said again, not louder, just firmer. He closed his mouth, nodded. They had 4 days before the week was up. She used all of them. She wrote letters, careful ones, to a lawyer in the territorial capital whose name her father had mentioned once, not because he'd ever been able to afford a lawyer, but because he'd admired one. She laid out the evidence about the interest discrepancy. She didn't ask for representation. She knew they couldn't pay for it. She asked for an opinion. She asked whether what she had was enough to argue with. She sent the letter with a writer, Silas, paid from cash reserves. She didn't ask the cost. He didn't mention it. She also sent a letter to a woman named Harriet Bloom in Red Willow, who had been her father's bookkeeper's wife before the business failed, and who Mara knew kept her own sharp set of records about everything that happened in that town's financial circles. She asked Harriet one specific question. Then she waited. Silas worked. He pushed the timber production hard that week, not desperately, but with focus, stacking contracts and filling orders with an efficiency she hadn't seen him sustain before. Understood what he was doing, building the visible evidence of what Frostpine Ridge could produce. Making the argument in wood and labor before anyone had to make it in words. She loved that about him. She registered that thought and then set it carefully to the side because it was not the moment for it. On the 3rd day, something happened that neither of them had planned for. Changed. She was outside feeding the mules when she felt it, not a temperature drop, exactly, but a quality change in the air, a density. She'd lived on the ridge for only weeks, but she'd been paying close attention because paying attention to the mountain was, she understood, the most basic form of survival available to her. She looked up. The clouds moving in from the northwest were not like the storm clouds she'd seen before. They were lower, darker, moving faster than clouds should move and still maintaining that kind of coherent, unified mass. She went inside and found Silas studying the same sky through the window. How bad, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Bad, he said. Maybe very bad. They spent the rest of the day preparing. He brought the mules up close, double secured the timber loads, reinforced the supply shed door, checked the roof supports on the barn addition, moved the feed stores inside, where the weight of snow couldn't collapse a separate structure on top of them. She packed the emergency supplies, organized the back room, moved water containers inside while there was still light. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The preparation had its own logic, and they'd learned each other's rhythms well enough to move through it without colliding. The storm hit overnight. She'd heard storms on the ridge before. This was different. This was the kind of storm that made you understand why mountains killed people not through any malice, just through scale, through the sheer indifferent enormity of what weather could be when it wasn't bounded by anything. The sound alone was alarming. The cabin held, because the man who built it had known what he was building against. But the sound of the wind in the timber above them was something she would not forget. She woke at 2 in the morning to a crash that shook the walls. Silas was already up. "Stay inside," he said. He was pulling on his boots. "What was that?" she said. "Something came down," he said. "Could be timber, could be the ridge above the north slope." He was at the door. "Stay inside, Mara." She stayed. She stood at the window and watched the darkness and the moving white and hated every second of standing still while he was out in it. But she stayed because he was right. She didn't know that terrain in daylight well enough, yet to navigate it in a blizzard at night. And a rescue was not improved by the number of people who needed rescuing. He was gone for 40 minutes, she counted. When he came back, he was covered in snow to the shoulder, and he had a cut on his jaw from something she couldn't identify, and his expression told her everything before he said a word. She put her hand out and touched his arm, which was the most she'd done, by way of physical contact in the weeks they'd been in this cabin. He stopped. She helped him out of the coat. "Tell me," she said. "Avalanche came off the north face," he said. He sat down heavily, took a section of the timber stock, the good section, the old growth I was holding for the spring premium contracts. She sat across from him. "How much?" "Maybe 40% of the spring value," he said. He put his elbows on the table and his hands over his face for a moment, just long enough to feel it, and then he brought them down and looked at the table. "Maybe more when I can see it properly. 40% of the spring value." She ran the numbers instantly and involuntarily, and what came back was not good. "The Slade offer," she said. "Yeah," he said. "We can't make it now," she said. "Not on the original timeline." "No," he said. "They sat with that." The storm was still going, loud and relentless, indifferent to what it had just done to their calculations. "He'll come back in spring," she said. "He'll see the damage, and he'll know we're weaker." "He'll also see we're still here," Silas said. She looked at him. "Men like Slade," he said. And there was something in his voice she'd not heard exactly before, not anger, not bitterness, a slow and certain hardness, the kind that forms over years of dealing with a mountain that does not care about your plans. They count on people leaving, giving up, moving somewhere easier. He's going to be surprised. Being surprised doesn't pay a debt, she said. "No," he agreed, "but it changes the negotiation." She thought about that. The storm raged on for another full day and into the next morning. When it finally broke and the light came back and she could see the north slope from the window, she understood why he hadn't wanted to describe it in detail the night before. The timber loss was visible from the cabin, a swathe of the slope simply gone, the trees that had been standing reduced to a chaos of broken wood and packed snow. Some of the timber might be salvageable. Some of it was buried too deep to matter until spring melt. Silas stood beside her at the window. "The mules," she said. "All accounted for," he said. "Lost a section of fence on the east paddock. But they're okay." "Good," she said. And then, because they were both looking at the destruction and she needed to say something true, "We're not broken." He looked at her. "The cabin's standing," she said. "The mules are alive. We have supplies for 2 more months." "We're not broken," he held her gaze. "No," he said. "We're not." She turned away from the window because looking at the damage wasn't useful yet. She went to the table and pulled out her papers. "Sit down," she said. "We need to recalculate," he sat. They worked for 3 hours. She recalculated the spring projections with the reduced timber stock, ran 2 different scenarios based on salvage estimates Silas provided, looked at what the mule rental income could contribute, and came up with a revised number that was honest, if not comforting. "It's still possible," she said. "Harder and slower, but possible. But we need another income stream, something that doesn't depend on the north slope coming back fast." He was quiet, thinking. She was quiet, thinking. Outside, the sky was clear now, brutally clear the way it went after a big storm, the kind of cold clarity that made everything look sharp-edged and slightly unreal. She stood up and went to the window again, but this time she wasn't looking at the damage. She was looking at the ridge line, at the shape of the mountain above them, at the trail that cut through it, heading north. She'd noticed the trail weeks ago. She'd noticed it the way she noticed everything automatically, filing it away because you didn't know yet what would matter. That trail above the North Pass, she said. Where does it go? Silas looked up. Old freight route. Goes through to the northern settlements. Nobody uses it much anymore. It's been deteriorating. The main supply road around the base of the ridge is the standard route. How much longer is the base route? He frowned slightly. Day and a half. Maybe 2 days in heavy winter. And the pass trail? If it were maintained? He thought about it. Properly maintained, with a good station at the midpoint, maybe 12 hours. Half a day. He looked at her. Mara, that pass gets serious ice in winter. Nobody's run freight through it in years because it's dangerous, she said. Dangerous, he said. She turned back to the window. We own the land the trail crosses, she said. He went quiet in a different way than his usual quiet. This was the quiet of someone who has just heard something that required him to rearrange a large number of assumptions simultaneously. We own most of it, he said carefully, and you know the terrain better than anyone. Mara and the mules are rated for mountain freight. Mara, she turned from the window to look at him. Tell me why it can't work before you tell me it can't work, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him doing it genuinely, not looking for confirmation of a dismissal he'd already made, but actually thinking it through. She appreciated that about him. He was a man who, when pushed, actually looked at the thing being pushed at him. The pass needs clearing, he said finally. That's not a one-man job. And there'd need to be a station, a shelter, a supply point. Freight companies won't risk their drivers on a route without a guaranteed stop. But if there were a station, she said. If there were a station, he said. And if the pass was cleared and marked properly, and if somebody managed the scheduling and the supply contracts for the station. I can do that, she said. I know you can, he said. And the directness of it, the total absence of qualification, moved through her like warmth. He stood up and went to the window. He stood beside her, and they both looked at the ridge line. It's a long shot, he said. Everything here is a long shot, she said. We're on a mountain in winter. Long shots are the currency. He was quiet. She could feel him thinking. She didn't push. She had learned that Silas Crowe made better decisions when he arrived at them himself rather than being pulled toward them, and she was patient enough to wait for that. I'd need to walk the pass before I could say anything real, he said. When can you do that? 2 days, he said. 3, depending on what the storm left on the north face. All right, she said. He looked at her. She looked at him. They were standing closer than they usually stood because the window was small and they'd both moved toward the view without particularly thinking about it. You're not scared, he said. Not this time as an observation. More like he was still finding it remarkable. I'm terrified, she said. I'm also looking at the only way forward I can find. Those aren't mutually exclusive. He held her gaze for a moment in the way that he was starting to do the long, deliberate look of a man who was paying real attention, not just politely looking. No, he said. They're not. He moved away from the window and pulled on his coat. He was going to go assess the timber damage now that the light was good enough. She knew that. She didn't stop him. Silas, she said. He turned. We're going to get through this, she said. Not as a comfort, as a statement of fact, the way she'd learned to say things that needed to be facts before she was entirely sure they were. He looked at her for one more moment, then he said simply, yeah, and went out. She turned back to the papers on the table. She had letters to write, numbers to recalculate, and a plan that didn't fully exist yet to build into something solid enough to stand on. But for just a moment, she stood still and let herself feel the full weight of where they were, 2 people on a damaged mountain with a debt they couldn't yet pay, a storm they'd just survived, and an idea that might be completely crazy. Then she sat down and started writing. She was still writing 3 hours later when the reply from Harriet Bloom arrived, carried up by the same writer they'd sent to Caldwell Crossing, who was heading back anyway. She opened the letter. She read it once quickly, and then she sat very still. Then she read it again slowly, with her finger under each line. Harriet had answered her question. One specific question about one specific thing Mara had noticed in the ledger, a property transaction, noted briefly on page 11 that didn't align with any of the other entries in terms of date or notation style. Harriet knew about that transaction. She knew a great deal about it. And what she wrote in her careful, precise hand, in the letter sitting on Mara Crowe's table on Frostpine Ridge, was the kind of information that did not just change a negotiation. It ended one. She read Harriet's letter a third time before she put it down. Then she got up and poured herself the last of the morning coffee, which was cold, and drank it standing at the kitchen counter because she needed to be on her feet while she thought about what she'd just read. Harriet Bloom was not a dramatic woman. She was the opposite precise, careful, the kind of woman who used words the way accountants used numbers. Nothing wasted, nothing approximate, which was exactly why the letter was so significant. Harriet didn't embellish. Every word she'd written was a word she was prepared to stand behind. What Harriet had written, in her careful, measured hand, was this: the property transaction on page 11 of Slade's ledger, the one Mara had noticed because the notation style was different, the ink slightly darker. The column alignment, just slightly off from everything around it, was a property that Slade had recorded as collateral against the Ellison debt. A piece of land her father supposedly pledged. The problem was that the land in question had already been sold before that pledge was recorded. Mara's father had sold it to pay a different creditor 2 years before Slade claimed it as collateral. The transaction was documented. The deed was recorded at the county office. Harriet knew because her late husband had witnessed the original sale. Slade had listed a piece of land he knew was already gone as collateral against a debt. He had built his entire claim on a foundation that included, at minimum, one deliberate falsification. Mara set the letter on the table and put her hand flat over it. This was not just a discrepancy. This was fraud. She was very careful with that word inside her own head because she knew the difference between what something looked like and what you could prove. But the distinction between looking like fraud and being fraud was a courtroom distinction, and before she got anywhere near a courtroom, she needed to understand exactly how solid what she had actually was. She needed Silas. She went to the door and called out across the yard. He was at the mule fence, working on the section of paddock the storm had damaged. He looked up. "Come inside," she said. "Now please." He heard something in her voice. He set down the fence post and came. She put the letter on the table between them. "Read that," she said. He read it. He was a slow, careful reader, not because he struggled, but because he gave every word the same weight. She watched his face while he read. He gave nothing away until he reached the third paragraph, and then something changed in his jaw. He put the letter down. He falsified the collateral, Silas said. "That's what it looks like. That's what it is," he said. "It's what we can show," she said carefully, "if Harriet is willing to say what she told me, and if the county deed record matches what she's described." "Can we get the deed record?" "I wrote to the county clerk last week," she said. "Before Harriet's letter, I asked for a copy of everything recorded under my father's name in the last 5 years. I didn't know what I was looking for. Specifically, I just wanted the complete picture." He looked at her. "You were already doing this," he said. "I'm always already doing this," she said. "I started doing this the day Slade put that ledger on my father's kitchen table. I just didn't know which thread would pull." Silas sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. She recognized that gesture now. It was how he physically created space to think, the same way she went flat-handed on a table or stood at a window. Everyone had a method. If the deed confirms what Harriet says, he said, "We don't have a 3-year repayment problem anymore." "We have a different problem," she said. "A better one." "We have leverage." "Leverage," he said, not repeating it blankly. Weighing it. "Slade's coming back in spring to collect," she said. "If we walk into that meeting with documented proof that at least one entry in his ledger is fraudulent, we don't have to argue about whether we can pay. We get to argue about whether his ledger means anything at all." Silas was quiet. She could see him thinking through the same sequence. She'd been thinking through the risks, the gaps, the points where the argument could fail. "He has lawyers," he said. "He does," she agreed. "We have a letter from a bookkeeper's widow and a deed request that hasn't come back yet." "We have that," she said. And we have my father's original loan notation, which contradicts the interest terms. And we have the property entry that doesn't match. And we have the ink discrepancy on the interest page, which isn't nothing. She paused. It's not as much as I'd like, but Slade doesn't know what we have. That matters. Silas looked at her for a long moment. You're not going to wait for the deed to come back, are you? He said. It wasn't quite a question. I'll wait as long as I can, she said. But spring comes when spring comes. He nodded slowly. Then he reached over and picked up the letter again and read the last paragraph one more time, and she watched him and waited. I'm going to walk the pass tomorrow, he said, if the north face is clear enough. She blinked. The shift was abrupt enough that she took a second to follow it. The freight route, he said. If we're going to build anything up there, I need to know what we're actually dealing with. I can't plan what I can't see. She understood. He was doing what she was doing, working two strategies simultaneously, because only one might survive to be useful. The Harriet letter was a weapon that might work. The freight route was a plan that didn't depend on anyone else's information being solid. All right, she said, I want you to stay here while I go, he said. Not because I know, she said, because someone needs to be here for the mules, and because you can move faster alone on that terrain. I know. He looked slightly surprised that she hadn't argued. I've picked my fights, she said. That's not one of them. He almost smiled, actually almost, this time. He left the next morning before dawn. She stood at the door and watched his lantern move down the trail until the trees swallowed it. She spent that day doing three things. She wrote a careful, formal letter to the county clerk in Red Willow, following up on her deed request and indicating urgency without explaining why. She wrote a second, shorter letter to the same territorial lawyer she'd written to about the interest discrepancy, this time including the specifics from Harriet's information about the property entry. And she spent 2 hours going through her father's account books one more time, this time looking for any notation, any at all, about the piece of land in question. She found it on the second pass through the third book. It was brief. Her father's handwriting was never tidy when the business was struggling, getting smaller and more cramped as the money got worse, as though he were trying to take up less space on the page along with everything else. But it was there. Date, amount, a buyer's name she didn't recognize, and the notation deed transferred. County Record E. Moss Witness. E. Moss. Not Harriet's husband's first name, but she'd signed her letter H. Bloom. Née Moss. Same family. Same witness. Mara sat back and pressed her hands over her face for a moment, not in distress, but in the particular physical relief of a thing clicking into alignment. She made a clean copy of the notation, noting the page and book number, and added it to the growing envelope of documents she was assembling. Then she put everything away carefully and made supper and waited for Silas. He came back as the light was going, moving faster than she expected, which told her, before he opened his mouth, that whatever he'd found on the pass was significant enough to hurry him back. He came inside and she put food in front of him, and he ate 3 bites standing up before he sat down, which was not like him. Usually he washed first, settled first. Tell me, she said. The pass is better than I thought, he said. The storm hit the south face harder than the north. There's ice on the upper section, but it's manageable, needs clearing and marking. But it's not the cliff face situation I was afraid of. He put down the fork. And there's a structure up there. Old relay station, maybe 30, 40 years old. Hasn't been used in a long time, but the walls are standing. The roof needs work, but the foundation is solid stone. She looked at him. Somebody already built the station, he said. We don't have to start from nothing. We have to repair and reopen. She felt something move through her. It was difficult to categorize the specific sensation of a plan that had felt theoretical becoming suddenly concrete and possible. How much work, she said. 2 men, maybe 3 weeks, if the weather holds, he said. I know 2 men in Caldwell Crossing who'd take the work. Brothers Holt and Davy Marsh. They've worked the ridge before. They know the terrain. Can we afford them right now? He thought about it. If I defer 2 of the smaller timber contracts to late spring and pay the Marsh brothers from that reserve, yeah. Tight, but it works. And the pass clearing itself? That's me and the mules, he said. 2 weeks of sustained work. Maybe less if the snow's cooperative. She nodded. She was already running the numbers in her head, mapping the timeline against Slade's probable return, against the county deed response, against the spring freight calendar. If we get the station functional by early spring, she said slowly, and we can show one successful freight run through the pass, we have something to put in front of freight companies. A demonstrated route, not a proposal, a record, and a record is what they'll pay for, he said. They won't take risks on paper, she said, but they'll pay for something somebody else already proved. They looked at each other across the table. The lamp between them was the only light, casting everything in the close, warm tones of a late evening in a small cabin. And outside the ridge was quiet in that particular way. It went quiet after a storm deeply, thoroughly still, like the mountain was catching its breath. This could work, she said. It could also fail completely, he said. He said it without self-pity, just as a fact. I want you to know I'm not promising you anything easy. I don't want anything easy, she said. I want something real. He held her gaze. Yeah, he said, me too. They began the next day. What followed was the hardest 6 weeks of Mara's life, which was saying something given the last several years of it. The work was unrelenting and unglamorous, and full of the specific tedium of large physical projects, the hours of progress undone by a single equipment problem, the careful plan disrupted by weather. The moment where everything had to stop and be reconsidered because the actual situation had revealed itself to be different from the planned situation. Silas worked the pass with the mules every day the weather allowed. The Marsh brothers Holt, who was talkative and efficient, and Davy, who was quiet and precise. The two of them somehow adding up to exactly one ideal worker arrived in the second week and began on the relay station. She managed the supply line, the accounts, the communication with Caldwell Crossing, and the ongoing document work around Slade. The county deed response arrived in the fourth week. She was alone when it came. Silas was on the pass. She sat at the kitchen table and opened it with hands that were not entirely steady, because she had been waiting for this for long enough that the possibility of it being wrong had become genuinely frightening. She read it. The deed was recorded exactly as Harriet described. Transfer date buyer, the Moss witness signature. 2 years before Slade's ledger entry claiming that same property as collateral. The county record was unambiguous. She sat with the document for a long time, long enough for the coffee to go cold. Then she added it to the envelope and wrote 2 letters, one to Harriet Bloom, thanking her in the careful, practical terms Harriet would appreciate, and one to the territorial lawyer, enclosing the deed copy and the transcription from her father's account book, and asking him directly, was this enough to constitute a documented fraud? The lawyer's reply came back in 11 days. She read it standing at the door because the writer had just handed it to her. The lawyer's opinion was measured as lawyers' opinions always were. She was learning, but his conclusion was clear. What she had documented was, at minimum, sufficient to raise serious legal questions about the validity of the entire ledger. Whether a court would find it fraudulent depended on evidence and argument and judge and circumstance, as everything in law depended on those things. But any competent opposing attorney who saw what she had would advise their client to settle rather than litigate. She read that sentence twice. Any competent opposing attorney who saw what she had would advise their client to settle rather than litigate. She folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket and went out to tell Silas. He was coming down the trail from the pass. When she started up, she met him halfway, which meant she was moving fast, and he read that immediately. What happened, he said. She handed him the lawyer's letter. He read it on the trail in the cold, and she watched his face. When he finished, he looked up at her. He'll settle, he said. He'll have to, she said, if he's advised properly. Unless he's not advised properly, Silas said. Then we litigate, she said. And we lose, probably, because we can't afford to fight him as long as he can afford to fight us. But he doesn't know that either. She paused. What Slade has always relied on is that the people he goes after don't know what they have. They take the first number he shows them, and they panic, and they settle for whatever he offers. He's never walked into a meeting where the other person had already picked his ledger apart. Silas was quiet. Looking at her with that careful attention she'd come to understand meant he was thinking seriously. "When does he come back?" Silas said. "I don't know exactly," she said. "Spring, when the pass clears. Then we'd better have something to show him when he gets here," Silas said. He handed back the letter and started moving again, back toward the cabin. "Come see the station." She fell into step beside him. "Now," she said. "Davy and Holt finished the roof yesterday," he said. "I want you to see it before we go further. You've been running the numbers on something you haven't seen. You should see it." She hadn't been up to the pass yet. She'd been managing the supply end at the cabin, and he'd been managing the construction end up the mountain, and they'd been meeting in the middle each evening to compare information. It had been practical. It had also meant she was planning around something she'd only seen in Silas's descriptions. They went up together. The climb took the better part of an hour on the cleared trail, and by the time the relay station came into view around a stand of old timber, she was breathing hard, and her legs were registering their opinion of the gradient clearly. But she stopped when she saw it. It was not impressive. She wanted to be clear about that inside her own head. She was not going to romanticize it because they'd worked hard for it. It was a stone-walled building, barely larger than her father's storage room, with a new timber roof that smelled of fresh-cut pine and a cleared area around it where the snow had been packed down by boots and mule hooves. The door was a replacement board Davy had fitted with borrowed hinges. But it was solid. She could feel solid. When she walked through the door into the dim interior, the walls were 4 feet thick, and they were not going anywhere. The floor was stone, and the space, while small, was organized with the specific practicality of men who understood that small spaces had to work harder than large ones. There were hooks along the far wall for harness and supply packs. There was a stove, not new but functional, which Silas had hauled up in pieces and assembled here. There was enough horizontal space for 6 people to shelter and wait out a weather change. There was a window on the downhill side that gave a view of the trail below, so anyone in the station could see arrivals coming. Mara stood in the middle of the room and turned slowly and looked at all of it. "How many mules can shelter in the lean-to outside?" she said. "4 comfortably," Silas said, 6 in an emergency. "And the trail above the station, to the northern descent?" "Cleared and marked," he said. "Holt did the marking. He has a system from his time with a survey crew. It'll hold through spring melt." She put her hand on the nearest wall. The stone was cold, but the mortar between the original courses was still good. Someone had built this to last 100 years and then abandoned it, and here it was, still lasting. "We need a name for it," she said. Silas looked at her. "A name. If we're going to pitch this to freight companies, it needs a name," she said. "A stop on a route needs a designation, something that goes in their dispatch records and on their maps." He thought about it. He moved to the window and looked out at the trail below, at the ridgeline visible through the glass. "Frostpine Passage," he said. She said it in her head. Tried the weight of it. It named the place, and it named the thing they'd built through it, and it was unadorned and direct, which was how she preferred things to be named. "Yes," she said. "That's right." They came back down as the afternoon light was going, and the temperature dropping fast, and she was tired in her legs and her back, and also something else tired in the specific way of a person who has done real physical work on something real, which was different from the tired of managing and calculating and waiting. She found she preferred this tired. She was quiet on the descent, and so was he, but it was the easy quiet now, the quiet that had grown between them over weeks of working side by side, the quiet of 2 people who no longer needed words to fill the space and had stopped worrying about that. About halfway down, on a section of trail where the timber opened on the downhill side, and you could see south toward Caldwell Crossing, and beyond that, theoretically, Red Willow. Silas stopped. She stopped beside him. He was looking south. She looked south too. The light was that specific winter gold that happened in the last 20 minutes. Before it went away, everything sharp and clear and slightly unreal. "I owe you something," he said. She looked at him. "An explanation," he said. "About Clara. About all of it. I told you her name and not much else, and I should have told you more." "You don't owe me her story," Mara said. "Not hers," he said. "Mine." He was still looking south, not at her, which she understood was how he could say this. I wasn't when she left. I wasn't heartbroken the way people thought I was. I mean, I was for a while, but mostly what I was ashamed. That I'd been wrong about her, that I'd built all of this. He gestured at the mountain around them, believing she'd be here to share it, and she looked at it and said, no. And I felt stupid. For hoping, he stopped. She waited. I decided, he said, that hoping for something from another person was just setting yourself up to feel stupid. So I stopped. I kept working because work is real. Work doesn't lie to you and then leave. But I stopped expecting anything from it except the work. Mara was quiet for a moment, and then you agreed to a mail order arrangement, she said. Expected nothing from it, he said. That was the point. It was practical. No hope involved. She looked at the gold light on the trail. And now, she said. He turned and looked at her directly, which was the thing he did when he was being very intentional about what he said. And now I'd like to keep hoping, he said. He stopped. Start it again. I'm not good at this. I know, she said. Not unkindly. I'm saying that what I thought was just practical isn't just practical anymore. And I'm aware that I'm not easy company, and the mountain is hard, and Slade is coming back, and everything is still uncertain, so I'm not asking for anything specific. I just wanted you to know. She looked at him. He looked back at her, steady and slightly uncomfortable and entirely honest. I know, she said again, and this time she meant something different by it. She meant I see it. I have seen it for a while. I've been watching it grow the same way. I've been watching myself grow something in the same direction. And I have not said it either because I was not sure it was the moment, and also because I am, apparently, not easy company myself, and have spent enough years managing things alone that trusting someone with the inside of a feeling is not a skill I've practiced much. She reached out and put her hand briefly on his arm, the same gesture she'd made when he'd come back from the storm. He looked at it. Then he put his hand over hers. They stood there for a moment on the trail in the last of the gold light. Then she said, "We should get back before full dark." "Yeah," he said. They went down. The weeks after that were different in a way she couldn't have fully articulated to anyone who asked, which no one did, because there was no one to ask. The work was the same. The mountain was the same. Slade was still coming. But something in the quality of the days had shifted, something in the way they moved through the shared space of the cabin and the yard and the trail, something warmer and less careful. She started sleeping properly. She noticed that one morning with mild surprise she'd been waking at 2 or 3 for months, her mind going immediately to calculations and contingencies. She was sleeping through now. The freight company letters she'd sent to 3 operations in Caldwell Crossing and 2 in the northern settlements began coming back. 2 were politely dismissive. 1 requested more information. 2 were genuinely interested enough to discuss terms, interested enough to ask about a demonstration run. She read those 2 letters aloud to Silas at supper. He listened without interrupting. "A demonstration run," he said when she finished. "Before they'll commit to a contract," she said, "they want to see the route work." "That's fair," he said. "It means we need to be ready before Slade gets here," she said. "If we can show him we have freight contracts, even preliminary ones, he can see what the operation is actually worth, and what he'd be destroying if he pushes this to litigation." Silas thought about it. A successful demonstration run changes the negotiation. "Everything changes the negotiation," she said. "That's the strategy. Every piece of information we bring to that meeting is a piece that shifts the ground under him." He nodded. "The Marsh brothers can stay on another 3 weeks. Davy's a good hand on the pass. Can we afford 3 more weeks?" He did the arithmetic in his head. "If the demonstration run brings in the freight fee we agreed on with the interested companies." "Yeah." "Barely, but yes." "Then let's do it barely," she said. He did the thing with the corner of his mouth. The demonstration run was scheduled for the 2nd week of March. When the pass conditions were reliably above the threshold, Silas had set as his minimum safe operation. She spent the 2 weeks before it managing the logistics with a focus she hadn't felt since her days managing her father's failing accounts, except this time the accounts weren't failing. This time the work was building toward something. She was deep in the supply manifest for the run 6 crates of general goods northbound, a return load of furs and dried provisions southbound, when Holt Marsh came down from the pass in the early afternoon, moving faster than his usual pace. She looked up. "Rider on the south trail," he said. "Well-dressed. Dark horse." She set down her pen. She'd known it was coming. She'd been watching the pass conditions herself, calculating when the south trail would be clear enough for a man who didn't know the mountain to attempt the climb. She'd thought they had another week at least. She'd been wrong by a week. She stood up and straightened her dress and took the envelope from the back of the shelf where she'd been keeping it, the county deed. Harriet's letter, the lawyer's opinion, her father's account book notation, the clean copy she'd made of the fraudulent collateral entry, and the 2 letters from freight companies expressing interest in the Frostpine Passage route. She held it in both hands for a moment. Then she called to Holt. "Tell Mr. Crowe, please. He'll be at the upper line." "Yes, ma'am," said Holt, and went. She walked to the window and watched the south trail. The dark horse appeared at the edge of the timber, exactly as she expected, unhurried, deliberate, picking its way up the cleared trail with the sure-footedness of a good animal and the guidance of a man who had made this trip before and was not concerned about making it again. Slade. She watched him ride into the yard and take in what was there: the organized paddock, the supply shed, the cleared and marked path leading upward to the pass, the evidence of a functioning operation that had grown considerably since his last visit. She watched him look at all of it, and she watched the moment when his face changed barely, but enough, the slight adjustment of a man who had arrived expecting one thing and found another. The door opened behind her. Silas. She could tell by his breath that he'd moved fast from the upper line, but he'd taken the time to wash his hands. She appreciated that it was the gesture of a man who understood that presentation was part of the argument. He came to stand beside her at the window. They watched Slade dismount. "You ready?" Silas said. She looked at the envelope in her hands. She thought about her father's kitchen, and the leather-bound ledger dropped like a verdict, and a marriage contract slid across a table by a man utterly certain the woman sitting across from him had no options. "I've been ready for months," she said. She went to the door and opened it before Slade could knock. He stood in the yard looking up at her, and this time his expression was not quite what it had been before. Something was different in it, not uncertainty exactly, but the beginning of the recognition that the ground had shifted since he was last here. "Mr. Slade," she said. Her voice was level and clear, carrying in the cold air. "We've been expecting you." She stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. "We have a great deal to discuss." Slade stepped inside and did what he always did, looked at the room before he looked at the people in it. She watched him take inventory. The organized kitchen, the papers on the table, the account books stacked with the particular neatness of someone who used them constantly rather than stored them. The wildflower in the tin cup on the windowsill, dried now but still standing. The lamp burning at midday because she'd been working in close detail and needed the light. The general evidence of a space that was being lived in, hard and purposefully. His eyes moved to Silas, who was standing at the far end of the table, and then back to Mara, who had remained near the door. She noticed that he registered the change in her without immediately naming it. He was sharp enough to feel the difference between the woman he'd faced in Red Willow and the woman standing in front of him now, even if he hadn't finished calculating what that difference meant. "Sit down," she said. She didn't phrase it as an invitation. He sat. He placed his ledger on the table in front of him, the same gesture, the same deliberateness. She had been waiting for that gesture and had decided in advance that it was not going to move her this time. It was a book, numbers on pages. She had better numbers. Silas sat at the other end of the table, not across from Slade, but at an angle present, visible, not confrontational. They had talked about the geometry of this the night before, briefly, practically. Silas was not going to be the loudest thing in the room. That was her decision, and he had agreed to it without argument, which was one of the things she had come, over these months, to love about him. He understood when something was hers to do. She sat across from Slade and put her envelope on the table. She did not open it yet. You've made improvements, Slade said. He was looking at her, not at the envelope, but she knew he'd seen it. The operation looks well managed. It is, she said. I appreciate industry, he said. I always have. Your father had ambition too. He just couldn't match it to reality. My father's situation is actually what I'd like to start with, she said. Slade opened his ledger. So would I, page 6. Page 11, she said. He stopped. She had the satisfaction of watching him stop, not dramatically. Not with any visible alarm, just a small hesitation. The pause of a man whose script has been interrupted at an unexpected point. Page 11, she said again. The collateral entry. Piece of land recorded as security against the Ellison debt. Slade turned to page 11. He looked at it. His expression gave very little away. She had to give him that. He was composed. He had probably been in difficult rooms before. But she watched his hands, and his hands were slightly more still than they needed to be, the stillness of control rather than calm. What about it? He said. That land was sold by my father 2 years before you recorded it as collateral, she said. The deed transfer is on record with the county clerk. I have a certified copy. She opened the envelope and took out the deed copy and placed it on the table between them. The sale was witnessed. The witness is available to make a statement. She placed Harriet's letter beside the deed, and my father's own account books record the transaction with date and buyer. She placed the transcription from the account book beside those. Slade looked at the documents. He did not touch them. The room was very quiet. Outside, she could hear the wind across the yard and the distant sound of the mules which Holt was tending, and nothing else. These are old records, Slade said. His voice was even. Paperwork gets confused over time. Dates get recorded incorrectly. Clerks make errors. 3 separate records from 3 separate sources with the same date, Mara said. That's not a clerical error, that's a pattern. She paused. I've also had a lawyer review the interest terms on page 4. The original loan agreement my father signed, which I also have a copy of, specifies a flat rate, no compounding. The terms on page 4 appear to have been added after the fact. The ink is a different composition. That's not my opinion. That's a chemical observation that any court-appointed document examiner could confirm. She placed the lawyer's letter on the table. Slade looked at the growing row of documents in front of him. She watched him do the same calculation she'd done. How solid is this? How much does it matter? Where does this leave me? You've been busy, he said. I have, she said. And you think this changes the debt? I think this changes everything about this conversation, she said. You walked in here with a ledger that contains at minimum 1 fraudulent entry and 1 set of interest terms that contradict the original signed agreement. I can prove both. That doesn't mean you owe us nothing. We're not claiming that. My father borrowed money. That money needs to be repaid at the legitimate rate with legitimate terms. She looked at him steadily. But what's written in that book is not the legitimate terms. And you know that. Slade was quiet for a moment. He looked at the documents, and then he looked at her, and then he looked at Silas briefly, as though checking whether Silas was going to say something. Silas looked back at him with the expression of a man watching something he's decided to let run its course. What do you want? Slade said. The same words Silas had used months ago in this same room. But different in Slade's mouth, heavier, careful, the words of a man who has shifted from position to negotiation. I want the real number, Mara said, the legitimate principal at the original rate. I want that number calculated honestly, set down in writing, and I want it paid in full today. She reached into the envelope and placed a single sheet of paper in front of him. I've already done that calculation. The number is at the bottom. He looked at the paper. She watched him look at it. She watched the moment when he understood that the number she'd arrived at, the real number, the honest number, stripped of the fabricated compounding and the fraudulent collateral, was dramatically smaller than the figure in his ledger. Small enough to be manageable, small enough that she had the cash ready, because she and Silas had been building toward this number for months. And in return, she said, you sign a full release. Every claim against my family, against my name, against this property, against Silas, against Frostpine Passage Permanent, irrevocable, witnessed. She put the release document on the table. The territorial lawyer had drafted it. She'd paid for that drafting from the freight company advance payment that had come in the week before. Slade looked at the release. He looked at the row of documents. He looked at Mara. "If I don't agree," he said. "Then we litigate," she said. "And the fraudulent collateral entry and the falsified interest terms become part of the court record. In Red Willow, where people know your name." She held his gaze. "You told me once that the courts there knew your name." "You're right. Which means the people there will be paying close attention to whatever comes out in discovery." The word discovery landed exactly where she'd aimed it. Discovery meant records. Records meant everything in his books, not just this ledger. She had no idea what else might be in those books. But Slade did. And Slade had just done the arithmetic on that risk in the span of about 4 seconds, because he was a smart man, and smart men, given enough information, eventually made rational decisions. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she had to resist the urge to fill the silence. She had learned, over years of difficult conversations, that the most important silences were the ones you didn't break. Break it, and you gave the other person a direction to push. Hold it, and they had to find their own way through it. She held it. Silas held it. The fire settled. "Your calculation," Slade said finally, looking at her paper. "Walk me through it." She walked him through it. She did it without triumph, without any trace of the satisfaction she was feeling, because triumph was a flavor that made men defensive, and defensive men stopped thinking clearly. She was precise, and she was fair. She included every legitimate element of the debt, every penny her father had genuinely borrowed, every year of reasonable interest at the agreed rate. She didn't understate it to make herself feel righteous. The number was the number. Slade listened. He asked 2 questions, both technical, both about the interest calculation, and she answered them directly. He didn't ask about the collateral entry again. That question had been answered by the documents on the table, and they both knew it. When she finished, he was quiet again, but it was a different quality of quiet. The earlier quiet had been calculation. This was something closer to acceptance, the particular stillness of a man who has come to the end of a road and is looking at the wall. "I need an hour," he said. "You can have it," she said. He stood and went outside. She heard his boots on the steps, heard him moving in the yard, the sound of a man thinking with his body the same way Silas chopped wood. She sat still and looked at the documents on the table. Beside her, Silas let out a breath that was long and slow, and she heard months of tension in the length of it. "He's going to sign," Silas said quietly. "I think so," she said. She didn't say it as a victory. Not yet. His lawyer will tell him to sign. Even if he doesn't call right now, he'll go back to Red Willow, and his lawyer will look at what we have and tell him to sign. You're prepared for him to walk out without signing today. "I'm prepared for anything," she said. And then, "Honestly, but I really want him to sign today." Silas looked at her, and the corner of his mouth moved. She didn't move from the table. She didn't pace or look out the window or do any of the things her body was suggesting. She sat and she waited and she breathed. 50 minutes later, Slade came back inside. He sat down across from her and looked at the release document. "The collateral entry," he said. "I want it understood that it was a recording error. A miscommunication between myself and the man who maintained my books at the time." "I don't need your explanation," Mara said. "I need your signature." He looked at her for a moment. Something moved through his face that she couldn't quite identify, not respect, maybe. Not exactly. But the specific regard that men like Slade occasionally extended to opponents who had beaten them on terrain they thought they owned. He picked up the pen she had placed on the table. He signed. She watched his signature appear on the release document, the same confident hand that had signed a marriage contract and placed it in front of her in her father's kitchen. And she felt the difference between that moment and this one move through her like the first warm day after a very long winter. Not explosive, not dramatic, just the specific cellular relief of a weight that has been pressing down for so long you'd stopped fully feeling it suddenly being gone. She signed as witness. Silas signed as witness. She had arranged for Holt Marsh to be the third witness he came in from the yard when Silas called him, signed where she indicated, and went back out without being told to. which was the kind of practical grace she had come to appreciate about the Marsh brothers. She counted out the payment in banknotes and coin. She had organized it the night before in the correct denomination, and she placed it on the table now in a way that was deliberate but not theatrical. The amount was what it was. It was the honest amount. She felt no shame in paying it. Slade counted it without embarrassment. He put it away. He stood. He picked up his ledger, the weapon, the book that had sat at the center of her life for the better part of a year, and he paused. He set it back on the table. "Keep it," he said. There was something wry in it, something that wasn't quite good-natured, but was at least the acknowledgement of a clean ending. "You've earned the right to read it." He left. She sat at the table after the door closed and listened to his horse leaving the yard, listened to the sound diminish down the south trail, listened to it disappear into the timber. Then she put her hands over her face and pressed hard against her eyes. She was not crying. She didn't think she was capable of crying about this. She'd spent so much of the last year managing her feelings into usefulness that she wasn't sure she remembered how to let them out in the direction of relief. But her hands were shaking slightly. She noticed. She had not noticed them shaking until now, which told her she had been holding a very great deal of stillness for a very long time. Silas sat down beside her, not across from her the way he usually sat. Beside her, he put his hand over hers on the table. He didn't say anything. She was grateful for that. She was so grateful for that she couldn't quite speak. They sat there for several minutes in the quiet of the cabin, while the fire burned, and the ridge wind moved through the timber outside, and the world, slowly, returned to its ordinary size. The demonstration freight run happened 4 days later, on a morning that came in clear and cold with the kind of light that made the snow look like something valuable. Silas led it 3 mules, 6 crates northbound, a 4th mule carrying supply equipment for the station. Holt went with him. Davy stayed at the cabin with Mara and managed the southern end of the logistics. She stood in the yard and watched them go up the trail. She had not asked to go. She had thought about it, had wanted to, genuinely wanted to walk that route herself and see it working, see the station in operation, see the thing they had built being used for what they'd built it for. But the southern end needed managing too, and she was better positioned for it, and she had long ago decided that wanting something was not by itself a reason to do it if not doing it was the more useful choice. The convoy came back the following evening with the return load and a contract offer from the Northern Freight Company that was better than she'd projected by 12%. She read the contract offer at the kitchen table while Silas was washing up, and she had to read it twice because she thought she'd misread the number. She hadn't, Silas, she said. He came in from the back room drying his hands. She held the paper up without speaking. He took it. "Read it." He set it down on the table and stood looking at it. He started. 12% above our asking, she said. They wanted the route, he said. They needed the route, she corrected. There's a difference. People pay more for what they need. He sat down. He looked at the paper and then at her, and the expression on his face was something she hadn't seen from him before. Not quite disbelief, because he was not a man who permitted himself disbelief, but the overwhelmed version of relief. The version that comes when something you had not let yourself fully hope for turns out to be real. "We're going to be all right," he said. It was the plainest thing he had said to her since that first night in the courthouse town, and it hit her in the chest with the same force that the plainness of his letter had hit her months ago in Red Willow, when she'd chosen him out of all the available options, because he was the one person who'd been honest about what he was offering. "We're going to be more than all right," she said. The year that followed was the hardest and best of Mara Crowe's life, taken all together. The Frostpine Passage freight contract brought a second company inquiry within 6 weeks of the first. By summer, they were running regular loads through the pass 2 days a week, and the relay station had been expanded. A second room added to the original stone structure, a full lean to replacing the original rough shelter. A water supply organized from the spring above the north face that Silas had located in the spring thaw. Holt Marsh stayed on permanently. Davy went back to Caldwell Crossing and sent his cousin instead, a young woman named Petra, who turned out to be the best at harness work any of them had seen, including Silas. Mara managed the accounts and the contracts and the correspondence, which had grown from occasional letters to a genuine and sustained communication with freight operators, merchants, ranchers, and the growing settlement at the northern end of the pass who were learning, slowly, that Frostpine Passage was not an obstacle between them and the South, but a connection. She was not universally liked. That was something she had understood early and made peace with, mostly. There were people in Caldwell Crossing who thought a woman running freight contracts was an oddity at best and a disruption at worst. There were merchants who initially sent their correspondence to Silas and had to be redirected. There was a freight operator from the South who came in person to renegotiate terms and addressed every sentence to Silas, despite the fact that Silas had told him twice that Mara handled the accounts, and Mara had eventually set down her pen and looked at the man and said, very pleasantly, that she would be happy to continue the conversation when he was prepared to have it with the person who knew the numbers. He had been prepared after that. Silas had said nothing during that exchange. He'd drunk his coffee and let it happen, and afterward, when the freight operator had gone out to look at the mule operation with Holt, he'd looked at Mara across the table with an expression she had learned, by now, to read fully. You enjoyed that, he said. A little, she admitted. He shook his head with the slow kind of amusement she loved in him, not at her expense, not condescending, just the genuine appreciation of a man who found the person he lived with consistently more interesting than expected. She was not a perfect operation manager. She made mistakes, miscalculated a supply need one winter, and they ran short on feed for 3 weeks before a resupply could get through, which was miserable for the mules and for everyone's temper. She took on a third freight contract in the second year before the capacity was actually ready, and they spent 2 months running behind and scrambling to catch up. She was impatient with problems that repeated themselves, which made her a difficult employer when the same issue came up twice, and she had to learn slowly, not elegantly, that people were not account books, and did not correct themselves simply because the error had been identified. Silas was not a perfect partner. He was still, in his bones, a man who defaulted to doing things alone when they got hard, and she had to push back on that more times than she could count. Push back on his tendency to take a problem outside and work on it physically before he'd told her it existed, which left her managing consequences she hadn't been included in causing. He got better at this. He did not get all the way better at this. She decided that was acceptable, they argued. Not often, but genuinely, in the way of people who took each other seriously enough to disagree at full strength. The worst argument was in the second winter, about money, specifically about Silas's decision to defer a supply payment to extend a mule purchase without telling her first. She was furious in the specific, cold way she got furious when she felt her competence had been bypassed, and she told him so in terms that were precise and not kind, and he got defensive and then angry, and then they were both quiet for a very unpleasant hour in a cabin that felt significantly smaller than usual. He apologized first. She apologized second, because she'd said 2 things she hadn't needed to say, and she knew it, and accountability was something she believed in for herself as much as she demanded it from other people. They were not a love story the way love stories were usually told, not the kind she'd read in the books her mother kept, where the feeling arrived in a rush and everything clarified overnight. It was slower and more complicated and less comfortable than that, and there were moments in the first year when she lay awake wondering whether she had made a defensible decision or just a desperate one. But desperation, she had decided, was not the opposite of wisdom. Sometimes desperate and right looked identical from the outside. The test was what you did with the situation after you were in it. What she had done was this: she had refused to be owned. She had worked. She had paid attention. She had told the truth when it was inconvenient, and held the line when it was frightening, and extended her hand to the man beside her when the mountain was trying to bury them both. And that man had cut a name out of his own frame in a blizzard because she'd asked him whether she was real to him or just a replacement for something lost. That was what she had built a life with. The letter from Vernon Slade came in the late fall of the second year, not from Slade himself, but from his office, which was how she knew before she opened it that it was nothing threatening. A threatening letter would have come from him directly, in the familiar handwriting she'd know anywhere. This was something different. It was a brief, formal communication from a business associate, informing her that Vernon Slade had closed his Red Willow financial operations and relocated. No forwarding address. No further correspondence anticipated. She put the letter in the kitchen stove. She watched it burn. She felt, watching it, approximately nothing which surprised her and then, upon consideration, did not. She had finished with Slade the day he'd signed the release. The burning was administrative. What she felt instead, standing at the stove with the last edge of the paper curling to ash, was something she'd been feeling in pieces for a while now, a quiet accumulation of something that had no dramatic arrival point she could identify, just a gradual weight of presence, of being where she was supposed to be, in the specific place and life and season she had chosen under pressure and then chosen again. Every day, in the smaller, quieter decisions that constituted a real life rather than a dramatic one. Thought about her father. She thought about him often. Not always kindly, he had made decisions that nearly destroyed her, and she had not yet managed to make peace with all of them. But she thought about the things he'd done well too, the way he'd taught her bookkeeping before she could read cursive properly, sitting her on the ledger stool and running columns together until she could do it in her head faster than he could do it on paper. The way he'd always believed, even in the worst years, that a clear account of a situation was the beginning of solving it. He'd been right about that. He'd just applied it inconsistently to his own life. She thought about her mother, gone a decade now, whose shawl was on the chair by the fire where it had been since the first week. She thought about the woman named Clara, whose initials were gone from the doorframe, but whose ghost had taught Mara, without meaning to. The thing she needed most from this man was the truth of him, rather than any version of comfort or ease he might try to offer instead. She thought, most often and most clearly, about a November morning in a courthouse in a town she'd passed through once and never been back to, standing next to a man she'd spoken 11 words to and making the most consequential decision of her life in full possession of the knowledge that she was doing it for survival, and the additional private knowledge, not quite admitted, that she was doing it because his letter had been honest, and honest, in her experience, was the rarest possible thing. Silas came in from the yard as she was still standing at the stove, and she turned around and he looked at her, and then at the stove, and back at her. Slade, he said. He's relocated, she said. Gone from Red Willow. Silas was quiet for a moment. Good, he said. Yes, she agreed. He came in and poured himself coffee and sat at the table, and she sat across from him. And the kitchen was warm, and the accounts were done for the day, and outside the ridge was going into the particular stillness of early winter that held breath quiet before the first real snow. The Harker's Crossing Company sent a letter, she said. I saw it on the pile. They want to discuss a winter contract. Dedicated passage through the north route, standing station support. It would require another hand at minimum. Petra knows someone, Silas said. I was going to mention it. Tell her to write, Mara said. I'll look at the terms if the person's qualified. He nodded, drank his coffee. She looked at her papers, and the papers looked back at her with the comfortable familiarity of something genuinely hers, not managed on behalf of someone else, not maintained out of desperation, but built and run and grown out of a choice she had made and kept making. Silas, she said. He looked up. She had been thinking about how to say this for a while, actually. She had gone back and forth on whether to say it at all, because she was not a woman who said things she wasn't sure of, and she had wanted to be sure. She had been sure for some time now, but the courage for it had taken its own time arriving, which she supposed was fair enough. I'm glad I wrote to you, she said. He put down the cup. I'm glad I was the one who wrote back, he said. They looked at each other across the table, and neither of them said anything more than that, because more than that wasn't necessary. The fire was warm, the ridge was quiet, the accounts were in order, and the past was clear, and the life they were in the middle of was not the life either of them had planned, which was the most human thing about it. One evening in the spring of the third year, when the pass was fully open, and the freight traffic through Frostpine had grown to the point where they were considering a second Rieslate structure on the northern descent, Mara came outside at dusk to find Silas standing at the door. Not at the door, at the frame above the door. He had his hunting knife out. She stopped. He was not cutting anything away this time. He was adding something. She watched him work in the last of the light, the careful, deliberate strokes of a man who did not do this kind of thing quickly. He stepped back. She looked up. 2 letters, carved clean and deep into the timber beside the old scar, beside the pale place where Clara's initials had been, the wood still slightly lighter than the rest after 2 winters. Not replacing the scar. Beside it, S&M. She stood looking at them for a long moment. The carving was good, not decorative, not ornate, just solid and clear and meant to last. She didn't cry. She had thought, when she'd occasionally let herself imagine something like this moment, that she might. But what she felt was deeper than tears and quieter, something she didn't have precise language for, because it had no equivalent in any experience she'd had before this life. It was not the relief of having survived something. It was not the satisfaction of having won something. It was something that had its own specific gravity, the weight of being fully in the right place, the particular fullness of a life that had not worked out the way you planned and had turned out to be more real because of that. Silas looked at her. He was holding the knife at his side, and his expression was that careful, undefended look that she loved best in him, the face he'd grown into over 2 years of choosing, each day, to let her see him. She walked up the steps. She reached past him and put her hand on the carving, feeling the fresh cuts under her fingers. Then she took the knife from him. He let her. She carved one more thing small. Below the letters, quick and sure, a single horizontal line connecting the S and the M, a line that had no particular name. That was not a standard symbol for anything she could think of. That just seemed right. That seemed to say, these 2 things, joined. She handed the knife back. He looked at what she'd added. She watched him look at it. Better, he said. Yes, she agreed. They stood in the doorway of the cabin on Frostpine Ridge, in the spring of the 3rd year, with the last light going gold across the timber, and the pass trail clear and quiet above them, and the smell of new growth coming up from the valley below, and there was nothing dramatic about the moment. There was no resolution of every difficulty. The next winter would be hard, and there would be arguments they hadn't had yet, and the ridge would remain what it always was, indifferent and demanding, and not interested in what you needed from it. But the cabin behind them was not a refuge from a life that had failed somewhere else. It was the place they had chosen and built and stayed in, together, through everything the mountain had offered by way of discouragement. That, she thought, was the truth that no ledger could contain, and no man could take from her by placing a leather-bound book on a table and calling it an ending. She had learned not easily, not without cost, not in the smooth and painless way that lessons arrived in the stories her mother used to read to her, that freedom was not the absence of difficulty. It was the presence of a life you had chosen, and survival, real survival, was not about escaping what was hard. It was about finding the person you could face it with, and then having the courage to let them stand beside you. The ridge was still dangerous. The winters were still merciless. Some things do not change simply because you have grown into them. But when the next storm came, Mara Crowe would not be running from it. She would be standing in her own doorway, under her own name, watching it roll in across the timber with the particular calm of someone who has already survived the worst she could imagine and discovered. On the other side of it, the worst had also been the beginning of something she would not trade for any easier life. That was enough. That was, in the end, everything.